introduce the gentleman who will be joining me today. We will be having a bit of a panel style discussion where we'll talk about some information. I'll present some stuff on the slides. Of course, our slides will be available to you after the webinar is complete. And then we will also have lots of opportunity for conversation. So please do post your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them as we can as we're going through. And if not, hopefully we'll have some time at the end. All right, are you guys able to see my screen okay?
Looks great.
Yeah, we can see it.
Looks great. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Ooh, and it's jumping ahead on me. Sorry, I just lost power at my house, so I'm having a little bit of trouble with my, there we go. Okay, perfect. So as we said, please make sure you add in your questions so that we can try to grab those as we go along. Otherwise, we'll make some time at the end to answer those. Also, please ensure that you are muted, and we'll give you guys some opportunity to speak towards the end. So we're going to talk a lot today about quality versus compliance. Why are those actually, they complement each other, but they are not the same. They are different, and we will go into that in more detail. We'll talk a little bit about some common mistakes that we've seen, and with the gentlemen who've joined me today, we've got, I'm not sure I even counted the number of years experience that we have on this panel today, but it's pretty extensive, and so we'll have some good stories to share. And then how do you really take your compliance program to that next level? So with me today, I've got David Schonecker, who is the owner of I can't see, I'm sorry, the Black Diamond Regulatory Consulting Group. Lots and lots of years of experience there in the industry and helping with building compliance programs. We also have John Pizzonia, who's a quality manager at KubTech. Very excited to have John on with us as well today. And then as Robin introduced, I'm Kelly Stanton. I'm the head of quality here at Qualio. What is Qualio? For those of you who maybe don't know, we are a web-based EQMS solution. If you want more information on that, please do reach out. We'd be happy to show you our software and share our philosophy on quality systems management with you. All right. So quality versus compliance. Why are we even talking about this? What's really changing here? You know, we all know that there are regulations, right? There are standards, there are rules. And as a QA professional, you know, we do sometimes joke that without those regulations, we wouldn't have a job. But the reality is that those regulations exist, you know, really to protect the safety of the patients, right? And so a whole lot of what we are talking about today, of course, is based in the regulations, but really compliance with the regulations is also good business practice. You're going to have happier customers if you are thinking about your products and your market from the customer perspective, as opposed to, well, gee, I just need to tick these boxes to comply with these regulations. And so the regulations, you know, as you comply with them, you are demonstrating a consistent quality management approach. You know, a lot of these regulations are harmonized across different countries around the world. So of course that's, you know, useful. And so your compliance activities in the US, for example, will often meet, or in some cases maybe exceed, depending on the country, the requirements to do business in that, excuse me, in that part of the world as well. It also demonstrates that you've understood and applied those requirements to your business. You know, do you know what it takes to operate in this market? What it takes to make and sell, you know, a pharmaceutical product or a medical device? And then also, you know, this entire industry shift towards more modern concepts like risk-based thinking and critical thinking and those kinds of things. What does that mean? You know, if you're just checking boxes to meet the regs, but you're not thinking about it in that bigger picture perspective, then it is difficult to demonstrate, of course, that you really are staying current with what the requirements look like. So as we know, we've got ISO, we've got the FDA, we've got the European Union, and then we can really, kind of go down from there into rest of world. Certainly, let's see, TGA in Australia, Health Canada, et cetera, et cetera. They are the gatekeepers of the market, and their job is to protect, the safety of the patient, the general public. They don't necessarily care how you run your business, as long as the products you're making are safe, don't hurt people, do the things that you say and claim that they're going to do. So why quality? Why does this matter? There's a lot of good guidance documents and good, reading out there. We here at Qualio are particularly fond of GAMP, and GAMP keeping current with regulatory thinking really across the world, and also being one of those well recognized and adopted across the world approaches to the thinking. So it's been historically, that we and especially in QA, right? We tend to check boxes, and we do this for compliance reasons, right? It's well, the FDA says we have to, and it's funny and also sort of sad, but that tends to be what we fall back to when we're challenged in our thinking around compliance activities. Often there are competing priorities from a business perspective. Maybe it's going to cost more money. Maybe it's going to delay my product launch if we do these other things that my QA team is asking for. And so QA historically really has thought about these things from a pure compliance perspective. And John and David, I'm sure you've maybe got some thoughts here about kind of how it used to be, but going forward, what the industry and the regulators really want to get to is this next level thinking of quality as a culture, quality undermining all the thought processes, not just coming down to, a few more bucks here and there. David, John, you guys have any thoughts on this shift?
I'll jump in. I totally agree with you. This is the direction that it's going, and this is something that's always been near and dear to me, and many of the activities I've had, both when I worked for many years at ColorCon and in my consulting role now, what I talk to clients about is that you got to get away from this idea of we're doing something because FDA told us we have to do it, and then QA people try to justify why they're saying you have to do it, and their justification is because it's in the regulation, because FDA tells us we have to do this. Frankly, what I tell my clients is I don't really care what FDA tells you. I don't care what the regulation says. That needs to be secondary. You need to be looking at this from a different GMP, from a good management practice perspective. Are you doing things for the right reason to have your company and your products positioned to be the most competitive in the world, seen as the best in the world? And if you do those things right, then compliance comes about as a matter of fact. Obviously, you need to comply to meet the minimum requirements, but that should never be the target. That should be the after effect of having done the right thing. And I think what FDA is seeing is, they've seen a history here of companies who aren't really worried about what doing the right thing is. They're worried about, did we meet the compliance checkbox, if you will, so that if an inspector comes in, we can tell them, yes, we did this, yes, we did that, we have a validation program, we have this. Nobody cares, unless it matters in terms of why your product meets the quality criteria that is going to be a benefit to your customer. And so if you try to sell ideas to your management people about, we need to make these improvements, we need to invest this money, etc., because we have to comply, I can tell you from personal experience, management people don't care. They don't want to do something because you have to comply. They may do it because you have to, but they're not going to want to do it, right? But if you can sell something based on the idea that we're doing this because it's going to make us more competitive in the marketplace, it's going to make us look better than the competition. I always like to talk about regulatory as being a marketing weapon. Okay, and I can tell you from my own experiences, when I've sold it that way, and you start talking about how it can take you to the next level with your customers, management people get on board as one of the greatest marketing plans anybody came up with. And they're willing to say, how much money do you need to make that happen? Now, it changes the whole dynamic of discussion when you can turn it from a compliance discussion to one of how this is going to allow us to expand our market. And this is what we need to be able to expand our market. Well, those are words that are golden to upper management people. And market expansion is what it's all about. Compliance is what we have to do. And we don't really want to do it, but we have to do it. And I liken it to the old example when I mentioned this to you earlier, Kelly. When your parents told you you have to do something and you asked the question why, and they said because I said so, well, you didn't feel like you really wanted to do it. You may do it, but you're not going to do it. You're going to do it begrudgingly, and you're going to do everything you can to get around it in some manner. That's not what we need, but yet historically, that is what this industry has done many times. So I'll turn it over to John now for thoughts.
Yeah, John, your thoughts here?
I just extend that I've had the experience with very large companies like Kodak and Fuji, Bruker, Edwards Life Sciences, where it's a much a different element in that they have deep pockets, and so compliance is certainly thought about from a couple of different perspectives in that regard. But working with a small company now, having quality out in front, as David said, is, you can certainly mold processes to be optimal for a business, and in doing so, then sell those elements to management in ways that are a lot more effective. And so you can steer a ship, a lot more easily. And so I'd offer for people in small and mid-sized companies in particular, it's a great opportunity to move away from just checking those boxes and really help a business to evolve in accordance with their business plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And to advance our slide deck a bit here, but it's going away from being reactive to being proactive and really starting to be very forward thinking. And again, a lot of our customers that we deal with here at Qualio are in that small to mid-size small to mid-size space from a market perspective. But sometimes you have to slow down in order to speed up. And so if you're being only reactive and you're not building it in as part of the culture to be forward thinking and to think about these things when it's easy and you're still small, once you start going faster and growing and getting bigger, it gets harder and harder to behave in a reactive way. And pretty soon you're in firefighting mode all the time. And as a quality professional, I can tell you it's not a fun place to be. But the real danger is absolutely in market. It is dangerous to have, you're a small company, you have one product, you have a quality problem that, results in a recall, you're done, right? That's the competitiveness of the market these days, the pervasiveness, if you will, of news. Coming out the other side of COVID, people are a lot smarter now than they used to be about the drug development process, for example. We all lived it with waiting for COVID vaccines to get here, right? People are a lot more educated now than they used to be about that process just because of the pandemic, for example. And so if you're not thinking about it in the context of the much bigger picture, not, gee, it's going to cost me a few more dollars, or it's going to take me a couple more weeks or months to get this done, then you really increase your risk later and you stay in reactive mode instead of being more proactive. And it's much harder to scale and grow if that's kind of your approach to things. So, yeah, let's be proactive. Let's think about how this fits our business. It isn't one size fits all. And you can use risk-based thinking to make those scale, to scale that appropriately from one direction or another. You can chase some of those stretch goals, which is always a good place to be, again, from a business perspective. And this is a place where quality can really contribute to that overall business approach. And then think about it in terms of a spectrum of compliance as opposed to it either is or is not. There are a lot of shades of gray in there. And the longer you're in this industry, the better you get at operating within those. But it's appropriate to take risks in the places that aren't going to result in patient harm, right? So that you can really focus your efforts on the places where like patient harm or product quality might be, might be a thing. All right, let's see. So moving along here. So where are all these changes coming from? I think a lot of us really, we historically tend to view, well, there's the FDA, right? There's the European, Medicinal Authority, there's EMA. They haven't changed those regulations in a lot of years, right? It's really about the guidances and the shifting and enforcement. And we all watch those trends for how things change. And I think sometimes too, as things change, right? We've got different technology, we've got different supply chain. All of these things have evolved in, especially, gosh, the last 5 to 10 years. Why is this changing and what does that mean? So in 2018, we had, at least here in the US, we had some massive problems with drug shortages. And why was that? What was happening there? The agency really viewed that as a problem for patient safety, right? If I can't get life-saving or life-sustaining therapeutics, people get injured and unfortunately, maybe people die. So again, that being their main focus of everything that they do, they really dove into that and wanted to understand what was happening. And so 31 senators, 104 representatives had asked for help. And some shortages lasting 8 years or more. That's just mind-boggling that we can't get something in this world, in this day and age, for 8 years. Why? What's going on there? And so they dove in and found some really interesting things. But one of the big foundational conclusions that they came to, was that most companies were focused on compliance with GMP, and they were not really thinking about the bigger picture from a quality system perspective. I can check this box. I can do this thing. I can document this activity, and I can check this box. But if you don't step back and look at all of the check boxes in the context of the bigger picture from a quality system and a business perspective, somebody couldn't check a box. Now all of a sudden we've got products that aren't available to the market, right? So that was definitely a huge shift in thinking, I think, across industry. There's a lot of ripples of this. And John or David, I don't know if you're seeing some of the effects of this now that we're a few years past this, but we're still all thinking about, for example, supply chain in the context of quality. What can we get or not get different products?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is still an issue, and there's still there are some companies who are doing a good job of getting outside the old paradigm, but there's still many that are sort of stuck in the old paradigm way of thinking, and even when you talk here, like on your slide, you talked about standards and compliance, etc. And as a consultant, I hear this from a lot of different people. Is everybody focuses, like you said, the regs haven't really changed much, right? But the guidance is where most of the action is, right? Well, everybody focuses on word to word what's in those guidances, and we have to do this, and everybody focuses on the paragraphs in the body of the guidance, and they forget about what the first paragraph says. And I point this out to people all the time. The first paragraph says, everything here is simply FDA's current thinking, but if you have a better way to do this and you can explain why you do it differently, that's okay. I mean, it uses different words than that, but essentially everything in every guidance is not a regulation, it's guidance. It's simply saying, this is our thinking about how to address this issue from a compliance standpoint, let's say, etc. But if you have a better idea and you can show us why your idea makes sense, we're all ears. And I can tell you from personal experience, I know a lot of guys in FDA I'm very close with, and I talk to a lot. And, they're very frustrated sometimes when they hear industry bad mouthing the FDA because, they're so prescriptive in what they say and it causes all this trouble. And the FDA guys are saying, like, did you read the first paragraph? If you have a better idea, come and tell us. we're all ears. We'll be open to alternative ways to think about this if you scientifically can justify your position. Now, that's the key. You can't go in there with a half-baked idea. You have to have the science on your side. But if you have the science on your side and you've done your homework, don't be afraid to do something that's different than what's in the guidance if, in fact, it's what you consider to be, as I said earlier, good management practice. It's your interpretation of what makes a better product, what improves the overall picture of compliance and high quality. And FDA will listen to that, but people are too afraid to go in with any justification for something different than what the guidance says. And sometimes that's because there's always going to be an inspector or a reviewer out there who doesn't get it, who isn't aligned with really FDA's big picture concepts that the management folks talk about. But you can't be afraid of those guys, because there are mechanisms that you can go over their heads if necessary to higher level people who will get it. And I think companies don't take advantage of that nearly enough to try to do what they believe is the best thing, rather than the checkbox mindset of, well, the guidance says you can't do that, so I guess we can't. So therefore, a whole path of drug development goes down the wayside that would have been a big benefit, or a manufacturing situation that you address in a different way.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I would just extend from your comment about quality and business, and use your example of risk. The idea, and one of the things that I've done or been able to do, again, getting away from having people just sign stuff and then move on, is incorporate cross-functional team into that risk making decision. And so people from the business side, people from the production side, everybody should take a look at this. They're going to have a different perspective, as opposed to just a regulatory guy checking that box that, no, this risk is acceptable within some compliance standards. So again,
Absolutely.
supporting opportunities of working both with smaller and mid-sized company size groups, as well as working with digitized information quality system has really helped to be able to focus on the right things and not just the compliance things.
You make a really good point there, John, if I can just have one more minute, Kelly, and that is that, in many companies, one of the biggest hurdles for business success is regulatory people who don't get it. Okay, and I'm a regulatory person, right? But I have taught many in my courses that I teach at the Temple University School of Pharmacy, and in my company that I used to be at, and as a consultant. A good regulatory person's job is not to tell somebody whether they can do something or not. Okay, yet a lot of them think that's their job, right? A good regulatory person is not to figure out how to say no, but to tell people what is it going to take to say yes, right? So how do we interpret this regulation and what we want to do, and find a way where we can say yes and scientifically justify it? And regulatory people who have been successful in their companies from a business perspective as well are those who don't come at it from you can't do it perspective, but from a perspective of, what do we do to say yes? And a lot of times that may mean, okay, we can't say yes right now, but here's all the things we need to do to get to that point. And that may include not only changing things in the plant or a procedure or whatever. It may include, how are we going to influence the FDA? How are we going to work with the trade associations to get the regulation changed if it doesn't make good sense, right? And you can't be afraid to take on all of those things to figure out how to knock down hurdles that can be that are not scientifically justified, and come up with a better approach. And I think that's again getting to this idea of, don't think about it from a compliance standpoint. Think about what's scientifically justified and makes for the best quality decision, and then let the compliance piece be the second part. And if you got to knock down a hurdle or deal with a hurdle, well, that's part of it, but that's not the objective.
Yep. Product quality, patient safety.
Absolutely.
Over and over again. Can't emphasize that enough.
Absolutely.
The color or the shape of the dot of the bullet point in your SOP, does that really affect product quality or patient safety? No. Is it look messy? Sure. Yep. But is there actually real impact here? And that's the thing you're focusing on? Like,
Well, that's
Yeah,
where
that's
your point earlier
the
about
wrong
risk
focus.
assessment. Yeah, it's got to be
Mhm.
really based on a risk assessment model, and FDA touts that at all the top management levels. In every meeting, you hear them talk. But if you're dealing with an inspector who doesn't get that and won't listen to a good risk assessment, then you can't be afraid to take it over his head sometimes. And if you know you have a good case, right?
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, only quality can affect these things. And what does that really mean? And I think that's where, we're seeing the regulators trying to push us as an industry away from that thinking and into, and demonstrate their acceptance of our approach to risk management, for example, right? Like, and if you've considered that from your product quality and your patient safety perspective, then you can step away from every single thing you do being the most critical thing in the business, because that hamstrings the business in the long run. That causes the drug shortages. Right? Like, is this really an issue or not? And it's not to say that you don't, continue to recall. I mean, at one organization I was at in my career, most of the recalls we had were things like somebody put the wrong IFU in a box. Like, yes, that's a breakdown in our process, but was that going to hurt somebody? This was product sold to doctors. The doctors knew how to use it, right? Like, so it's just interesting. I feel like too, a lot of the resistance I hear of is the uncertainty around, are they going to buy my approach? Are they going to agree with me? And, they might not. But if you have tied it back appropriately to patient safety, product quality, and then everything from there, you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. All
Well,
right.
it gets to
So,
that point that we can't fear regulators. We got to look at them as partners and basically
yes.
show them why we're so good, and instead of fearing that they're going to find something wrong with our argument, justify why our argument is so good that they can't poke any holes into it. And that changes
Yep.
again the whole focus of how you develop your programs.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so it was interesting, to sort of continue into this, because I feel like we've done a whole lot of expanding on the regulatory aspects related to, the drug shortages that the FDA had investigated. But, the biggest root cause here of these three is absolutely the last one. Historically, manufacturers have been rewarded for compliance, not their quality system maturity. And so by shifting, really shifting what they're looking for, they can really start to get an idea of your overall quality management system and the overall processes, not just, did you do dot control appropriately and were the right people trained and blah, like all of these things that are sort of foundational. They've shifted their approach. When they come in and look at your CAPA processes, they're not necessarily, and it's not to say they're not going to comment if, there are, documentation errors or those kinds of things in those processes. They're looking at it from that sort of bigger picture perspective. Are you considering lots of things when you do root cause analysis? Are you looking at it from a bigger quality system perspective, not just, again, to keep hammering on check the boxes from a compliance perspective. But, a mature quality management perspective takes a lot of those things into account and then focuses on the things that are important, not all the things, because not all the things are important. All right. So what are some common mistakes? I think we could probably spend hours given the experience that we have on this panel today. We could probably spend a lot of time talking about this, but I love this sort of idea where, we're talking about a fear of regulatory punishment and we're not really looking at overall process performance. We're just looking at the individual product release activities, and we're not looking at it from a bigger system perspective. Or, we got our QMS in place, we got our ISO cert, we've got our product approved, we're going into the market and we're done. Yay, we're never going to do any process improvement or quality system improvement or, product improvement based on feedback, right? Like all of these things, because that's change, and change is scary. And oh my gosh, are we going to document all the things from a regulatory perspective if we make a change to our product? We view all of these things from a place of fear, and not upgrading manufacturing processes. I mean, this is one of the biggest reasons for the new GAMP guidance update, is that the regulators and the industry guidance folks like ISPE, who wrote GAMP, recognize that there is still this resistance in industry to doing quality system improvement because they don't want to change anything. I've got my approval, I don't want to change anything. So, and this is especially true within pharmaceuticals, more so than device, and even more so in generic pharmaceuticals, where they don't want to spend the money, right? They've already got really tight margins that they're trying to hit. But again, I would argue that's a place where, slow down now to speed up later, spend a little investment, your ROI will be big. And part of that is considering, the regulatory steps you have to go through to make that change, to do the implementation. All right, so if we dive into each one of these a little bit more, upgrading manufacturing quality. Boy, from my time as a quality engineer on the floor, what are you changing? Why are you changing it? Oh my gosh, here's the pile of documents you have to generate because we're making a change to a tablet press or something. Like, it is phenomenal to me. The expectations that are set and the bar is so high, when it's like, if we would just do this, it would be so much easier. We could crank products out faster, right? But, we're not checking all of these boxes. And there's this, there's this restriction in the thinking around these changes. So a lot of the issues that we're seeing around, upgrades to manufacturing QA activities, right? Your purchasers have no visibility of the end manufacturer, the quality and maturity of that manufacturer. Again, speaks directly to supply chain problems. No price premiums or market advantage for mature companies. It's not like Pfizer gets to charge more just because they're Pfizer, right? So we've got a lot of external pressures that drive some of these decisions as well. And sometimes without that really solid risk assessment model, it's really hard to justify the ROI on this change, even if, the folks on the floor, for example, know it's going to speed them up, 5% today. Okay, great. That doesn't sound like much, but let's do 5% over 3 years or 5% over 5 years. That's a lot, right? It really does add up. There are currently no penalties for companies who are still, using old equipment and old processes, right? As long as you're compliant, nobody really cares. And none of that's visible, although that is changing. And I think we'll get to that here in a bit. And then, if it's easier to minimize costs, right? This is the whole business argument for it. We don't want to invest in this QA stuff. It's going to cost money. John, David, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think you're making some really good points, and it really comes down to people not looking at the total cost of quality and simply looking at the price or the immediate costs, etc., and not really understanding how to go about looking at a total cost of quality type model. But again, the drive towards minimizing cost, as you have in the last bullet point there, is something that can have a dramatic negative impact on you in many cases, but you don't always find out about it right away. And coming out of the excipient industry, like I did, you see this all the time. Is people will do all their development work with high quality excipients from really good suppliers that are very consistent, etc. They'll develop their formulation, their bio batches, they'll get it all approved. And then what happens is, as soon as it goes into commercial production, purchasing gets a great idea that, hey, we can get a 10% price discount on this excipient if we buy it from someplace in Indonesia, right? And, it meets USP, it meets the same specs. And then all of a sudden they switch to a new supplier and the whole process goes south. And that happens over and over and over again because everybody keeps trying to minimize the cost of their materials, which are the most important thing in the drug, whether it's the API or the excipients. The excipients are no less important than the API. And yet people always think, well, they can save money on the excipients, right? And you know, the quality of the excipients will many times dictate your success in operations. And again, you talked earlier about war stories. Probably many who are on the line today could tell you great war stories about the problems they had because of purchasing, changing some supplier of an excipient that made everything go south, whether it was the stability of the product, the manufacturing process, etc. And yet that still tends to be a focus. Purchasing agents get rewarded by lowering their raw material costs instead of looking at, well, what are the best suppliers we can use that are going to make our operation work better? And if we have to pay a little bit more for those, probably in the long run, if we're actually looking at total cost of quality, we're going to save a lot of money and we're going to have a much more consistent operation, lower rejects, all that kind of stuff. But yet people talk that game, but only a few companies actually operate that way. And I've worked with companies where, you know, I've heard their own people out at conferences talking the right way. And then I've seen what they actually do with suppliers because I've been on that side of it, and they don't act the way they talk, you know, in many cases. And that's what has to change to get into this idea of maturity as it relates to these types of things related to how do you minimize cost? You can't do it and make sacrifices at the same time.
Yep, absolutely.
Sure. Yeah. No. I just offer this. Certainly, having scalable archives and interrelational databases to house these data are an effective way to cut out a lot of busy work that's associated with maintaining compliance, right? You know, but once you do that, the company's going to grow, either bringing in new products, for instance, or making engineering changes in existing products. You've got to have competent templates that you know, can help guide you through either commercialization process and or vendor qualification, if you will, and so that those processes are really repeatable. Those are the things that are going to really help you to be successful ultimately. If the busy work around them becomes easier, certainly then you can focus again to harp on risk, but you do risk right. Again, it is a good element to have you know, new regulatory entities really focus on. Because risk isn't everything, and I struggled with that, you know, with a smaller company. But more recently, I've found with the tools that I have, it much easier, like I said, to get cross-functional input into these risk decisions and really make sure that the things that are changed are changed not necessarily to meet newer compliance regulations, but they're changed in order to meet better business practice.
Totally.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I was just looking ahead and I think you just spoke to the very next slide I'm about to show. So I just wanted to touch on this one really quick because I feel like we're moving forward here through the conversation. You know, the focus is compliance and then what comes next. And they're like, okay, well, on to the next product. And everybody just picks up and moves on and nobody considers the bigger picture over time. And so, you know, I really love what you were saying there, John, about, you know, the data and we have so much data at our fingertips now that we didn't used to have, right? I can remember when I first started in this industry, we were still doing QC release test as a bench chemist on carbon copy paper, printed forms that were numbered that got issued to us by QA, batch record department, right? And so all of that data, all of that information in those carbon copies, one stayed in the lab and one went with the batch, right? And all of that stuff, right? And nobody was then taking that information and putting it into like a spreadsheet, for example. So how could we, you know, take that and then analyze? Well, it was a few years later at a different organization where while we still had a paper batch record system, there were elements of that would get entered into a system. And so as a quality engineer, I could pull that data and look at the release concentration, for example, for every lot, and then see as it drifted over time. Oh, look, here it spiked. Why did it spike? Oh, that's a different excipient. Okay, perfect. Well, what are we going to do? Do we need to do anything? Nope. Okay, boom, it came back. All of that information. And so there's so much information. There's so much information out there. And if you look at it from a business perspective, but also from a patient perspective, right? What's important to your customers that you're selling this to? I feel like Device does a pretty good job of that with design control, and one of those elements of being, your inputs and your customer requirements. We don't do that in pharma. We just make drugs, and people will need these, so we'll sell them. Maybe they need it to be better. Maybe they need it to be more consistent. Maybe they need, right? There's lots of opportunity there to leverage this data that's being generated in lots of different places. But if we're focused on checking boxes, the GMPs don't require us to look at that.
Well, I think that's also where, there's a lot of discussion about quality by design as being part of that solution. And some companies do that very well and utilize the tools and the processes very well. Other people like to say they're utilizing quality by design, but they only say that because they think it's a compliance expectation now. And they don't really get that what you do with that in terms of helping design the product from the day one based on process and product and material understanding is what brings you to, again, that total cost of quality concept of what's the best product, not just is it a product that's good enough to get by. And so, again, there's a lot of companies out there, and I do a lot of work in this area, who really don't understand what quality by design is all about. It's not about just tightening down your specifications and that type of thing. It's about getting that intimate understanding of your materials and your process and how they interact, doing that science work up front, and then so many problems can be resolved later. But again, you can't shortcut that. You've got to do the investment up front in the time to do it, and then you see the big savings. And like you said, in the generic industry, there's been a push, for quality by design concepts, but a lot of generic companies don't really understand what it means.
Yeah, definitely. Or I think too, once we get to commercialization, I think we have a tendency to look at development data as not useful. And there's so much that you learned in that development process that didn't seem important at the time, but you never know when you're investigating a problem, 2 years later. Oh, look, we actually did see this in development. Why did we decide this wasn't a thing, right? And so tying it all back together, looking at all of those possibilities as inputs and bits of information that could, might become really important later, but it's locked in some, R&D lab notebook.
We still have the old paradigm that exists in a lot of companies of development does their thing and they get the drug approved, and then they throw it over the fence to operations and let operations deal with it later. And operations doesn't really want to talk to the development guys because they feel they threw it over the fence and didn't tell us anything. And instead of doing the investigation, so not having an appropriate teamwork going on between development and operations is still a major problem a lot of companies have. That, again, if they want to get to this point of quality system maturity, you've got to solve that problem, because you can't have that concept of throwing it over the fence anymore. Development and operations have to be part of the same team, intimately integrated in a way that all that information is available. And when operations learns about a problem, it goes back to development. And development, instead of working on a new product, they go back and they try to fix the old one a little bit more than just putting a Band-Aid on it, but actually try to solve the fundamental problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Actually,
John, go ahead.
One of the things I've done to try and forward that is, again, having clear delineations within my quality system for things that are, say, living and breathing versus one and done, right? That's the way. So, a CAPA event may be a one and done, but associated documents with that, clear examples from the engineering side would be something like a FEMA, right? A FEMA lives and breathes along with the document and is augmented through post-market surveillance in order to be updated. What I've done is I've brought more stuff over to the living and breathing side from a doc, something you might not necessarily consider a document, but I can set that up for periodic review. All right, let's take a look at that 12 months from now and make sure that it still meets good business practice, still makes sense for us. And I think it's just a way of refreshing the thought process for things that you might think are done and put to bed, in the future in order to ensure that it still all makes sense.
Absolutely. And you're doing those things if you're focused on the patient, not the auditor, right? If all we're focused on is getting through the audit, then we check the box. Once it's in market, it is a living, breathing thing. There are customers using your product or taking your product, whatever that may be, and there is information there that should feed back to your processes. And if all you're doing is checking those auditor boxes, you're not looking at that bigger picture, and you're missing a massive opportunity to improve your products, to market yourself as a company that cares about the patient. Hey, we take your information and it feeds into our next iteration of whatever that may be, right? And again, I feel like historically people have done those sorts of things in device, but in drug, we don't necessarily think about it that way, but there's so much opportunity to do that.
Well, if you look at, FDA over the, recent past has even tried changing the way they're structured and the terminology, and this whole concept of life cycle management is really a lot of what we're talking about here. And FDA, it has restructured the way they even, work themselves to get into a better life cycle management process of where that kind of continuum goes. But again, some companies get it. A lot of other companies don't, and they still keep working on the old paradigm, even though we're seeing the regulatory agencies start to move in significant ways to address all these new challenges. And some of what you talked about before, when you look at things like changing manufacturing processes, the current push you have within the agency to move everybody towards thinking about continuous manufacturing, for example, and advanced technologies. I mean, I've never in my career, I've never seen a regulatory agency push the industry to try to improve their manufacturing techniques like you're seeing happen now at FDA. They have invested tremendously in helping the industry. All the questions that industry thought FDA could never answer, FDA is answering those questions. They're helping companies. They have the emerging technologies team to essentially be your advisor to help you get there, right? So again, if you don't jump on board that train, you're going to get left behind the caboose, and I think that's what we're really talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And this ties into, it's fear of being audited, right? We look at that as a scary thing when, the reality is that the agency really does want to partner with us. They really do care about, because again, this all feeds directly to patient outcomes. Better products, product improvements, all of these innovations, making product, all of those things enable the supply chain to be better. They prevent drug shortages. They prevent, and so it is really been a really good thing, I think, that the agency is shifting their focus there. It'll be interesting to see what that looks like as we watch, as we do in industry, right? We watch enforcement trends. And so we'll continue to watch for that interpretation to kind of help us figure out. But, they really have, the FDA has identified that an excessive focus on compliance rather than quality means we're not focused in the right place. And there are all of these other ripple effects that come because of that. So again, it really does inhibit us as an industry in our innovation. And again, whether that's the new drug development process or that's really improving our existing products that are out there and not getting enough, improvements from a manufacturing process, improvements from a supply chain process, all of those kinds of things, because ultimately what holds us back really does have an impact on the patient. So, and then this pervasive fear. And so we write everything down, including whether our bullets and our procedures are round or square. Is that really what matters? No, it's not. So, we have some case studies that we've done. And so feel free to check out our website with various customers. And of course, obviously, being a provider of services to the industry, things are going to be, from that point of view, but it really is amazing to watch these different organizations and working with QTech, that was another one for us, that, to help really start to streamline the processes, strip it back to what's really actually important. Get off paper, people. Please just get off paper. I think in an interest of time, I have a short video, but I think I'm going to skip over it and I will send out links. It'll be in this presentation. We have a really great series of interviews with one of the authors on the committee who wrote GAMP, the recent update. His name is Sean Wynn. I really encourage you to go check those out. It's a great sort of summary and overview of the old thinking versus where we're trying to go. The regulators really are trying to encourage us to go in a direction of innovation and more mature quality system thinking instead of just check boxes. So I'm going to skip over this really quickly because again we're running out of time here. Come on now, there we go. All right, and also we have the Consumer and Quality Sentiment Report up on our website as well. It was really interesting. So we recently conducted a survey of consumers and what do they think about quality in the industry and the quality of the products that they put in their bodies or that they buy from a medical device perspective. A lot of really eye-opening information in that. As an industry, I think we kind of feel like we operate in a bit of a bubble, if you will, and that we can kind of just as long as we keep putting product out the door, nobody's going to pay attention to, is there a problem or is there not a problem? But in this day and age of everything is available to me through Google and an increasingly, savvy consumer, they are researching products and researching company names. And if you have gotten in trouble with the agency, while it may not make, the front page of the New York Times, it is out there on the internet, that some press release happened. As we all know, the FDA website and everything is public there, right? Freedom of Information Act makes recalls and warning letters very public, and searching a company name, that will pop up. So if you're regularly getting in trouble with the FDA because of your quality systems, the consumers are going to find that, and it's going to color their perception of your product, whether that's real or not. We all know, oh, it was just a wrong IFU in a box, right? Not a big deal, except, the consumer doesn't necessarily know the difference. They just know that you got in trouble with the FDA. Well, I guess I'm not going to buy any products from them. So do check that out. And the link is, again, available in the slides. We will send that out to you. So how do we move beyond compliance? What does that look like? Well, Brett, I see that you've just asked that question. How would something like FDA's Quality Metric Management Maturity Program help us move past? That's a great question, and here's your answer. The agency is very interested in making very visible. And how do we make these things visible? And then how do we do it in a way, one, that can be consistent from one operation to the next? Because, again, making drugs is different than making Band-Aids, is different than making pacemakers, right? There's a lot of variety across, all of the things that they regulate. But the agency is focused on this. And so there's an advisory committee coming up in November to tune this Quality Management Maturity Program. It's been in pilot for a while, and then this updated white paper came out back in April. Lots of conversation happening. At the FDA PDA Joint Regulatory Conference recently, this was one of the topics they spoke on, and trying to come up with ways to standardize those things, from a way that's meaningful, but across organizations, not just within an organization. And so it was interesting. They did have some ideas on what they wanted to see from a quality scores perspective. What they didn't do was tell you how to do those measurements. They will leave that up to you. And much like the risk-based approach, you will do this, here's what we want to see, but how you do it must be meaningful to your business. It must be useful information based on your processes and your your products. So, so really excited to see this come out, and you know, and then again too, you know, acknowledgement and promotion of good quality practices. What does that look like? You know, and so I think we'll start to see a lot more of this coming through, and how to interpret and apply, right? Because that's where the real variety is. All right. And yeah, I already spoke to the PDA FDA joint conference. Some of our sales guys, we were just there a few weeks ago. That was a lot of fun, but very much they spoke to, you know, these sort of key ingredients, right? What are you measuring? Are those the right things to measure? Is your management committed to supporting you with this? Are you looking at this from a customer or patient perspective, not just what's best for the business, but what's actually going on in your customer base? How is that information coming back into your organization? Are you leveraging that for continuous improvement? And is that driving all the way back into your operations and manufacturing strategies? Because again, not all of these things necessarily affect the bottom line from a dollars perspective, but they are absolutely going to, you know, they absolutely are going to be visible from a consumer perspective. All right, so some of the QMS effectiveness metrics that the agency had presented at the conference had to do with things like, do you have the same failures over and over again? Are your CAPAs regularly passing effectiveness checks? You know, change control effectiveness. I think this was one that, you know, generated a lot of questions. What does change control effectiveness look like? How does that affect the business? And then of course, equipment effectiveness, you know, in a manufacturing setting, right? Are you repairing things a lot? Maybe it's time to invest in some new technology if you're constantly having to take things down for maintenance. Tracking and trending, those kinds of things. The GMPs don't speak to equipment maintenance other than saying you have to do it, right? But if you're actually trending that over time and you're like, oh, wow, well, tablet press number 10 sure seems to be failing a lot, maybe we need to invest there instead of simply repairing it over and over again. Lab performance, same kinds of things, right? So for those of you with testing facilities and testing labs, you know, lead times, you know, calibration speeds, right first time rates, all these kinds of things, not GMP metrics necessarily, but definitely overall mature quality system metrics in how you're operating your business. Manufacturing performance, very similar, right? Right first time, process capability. That's an interesting one. I could probably spend a whole hour talking about that one, and resistance I've seen to wanting to implement that. But again, you know, if you've got that piece of data in your batch record and you just take that piece of data from all your batches, what is that telling you? There's a lot of information to be had there. Supply chain strength. I know, David, this is one of your favorites, being in the excipient world, but this is a thing that people weren't necessarily looking at. For the longest time, all that pharma did necessarily was just test and accept the lots they received. And no real consideration was given to the quality systems in place of your vendors. Have you even looked at those, right? And I remember when that guidance went into place back in, was that 17, I think it became final. And all of a sudden everybody's like, oh my gosh, what do I do here? Well, it's a partnership with your supply chain, and all of those things together make your product available to the patient. Quality by inspection versus quality by design. And David, you spent a few minutes talking about quality by design earlier. But, you know, again, this is a reactive approach. If all you're doing is inspecting at the end versus proactively collecting information, analyzing that information, and then figuring out how that feeds back into your systems. All right. So we've got an upcoming webinar on quality culture. So do join us, and there'll be more information in the slides on how to get there on that. You know, we've really seen how, you know, bureaucracy impedes real quality. The FDA thinks misdirected management attention is responsible for the excessive focus on compliance. So we're going to talk more about quality as a culture and how to sort of take it to that next level. So as some final notes, and again, I'm sorry for zooming through, but we've had so much great conversation, we're about out of time. Quality first approach centers on continual reflection, improvement of your processes. So really looking at things from that bigger picture perspective. And now that we've got the FDA embracing this, even with their quality metrics focus, that we really want to compare companies, to themselves. How is my performance over time improving? And there was a question in the chat where Steve had said, hey, how do I compare quality of company A to quality of company B? That's a really fascinating question. I think as we all standardize on the metrics that the agency is going, to hold us to from that quality culture perspective, that gives you a good place to start for sure. And so, I can see a world where, as an informed consumer, if I can't go look up the quality metrics for an organization because they're not participating in this program, I might ask my doctor not to use that product. And this is especially the case in the device world where we have some visibility into those things. Sometimes we have less control over that in our drugs because insurance companies get involved, and that's a conversation for another webinar. But I do think that it's going to be a differentiator in this world where we make buying decisions based on the number of reviews on Amazon, right? Pharmaceuticals and devices aren't going to be that different. It's all very visible now, and customers are paying, or consumers, I should say, really are paying attention a lot more, I think, than people give them credit for.
And Kelly, let me just jump in on that. Again, I think people need to realize that even though the patient may not always have complete control over picking which drug they're, or supplier they're going to get it from, the CVS's, the Walgreens, the Amazons, and the Costco's of this world, who are ultimately the distributors of these materials, they do get to make those decisions, and they will be looking at this data to decide who they want to be sourcing from. And so, that's ultimately who the interim customer is in today's market, even more so than the patient in terms of what this kind of information could mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and then, standards and guidelines still there, still important. We still have to comply, but they're the basis for compliance. They're not the end all be all for compliance. And so, I think as the agency shifts towards, at least here in the US, right, alignment to the ICH Q10, one of you commented in the Q&A about the FDA's shifting to recognize 13485, right? One of the major differences between 820 and 13485 is that customer feedback element, right? We weren't required to do it under 820. We are required to do it under 13485. There is so much benefit to that. It feeds our design process. It feeds our improvement process. It feeds all of these different things because it's customer and patient focused, not company and business focused. And that's going to be a huge shift as well. And I think that, ICH Q10, I've always loved how aligned that is to ISO, because as someone who's had to operate, around the world from a regulatory perspective, I've always felt like the ISO regulations were easier to understand and apply than, 210, 211 being very interpretive, right? And so, I think that the agency recognizes, again, based on all of these things that we've already talked about today, the patient focus really does improve outcomes all across the board. And then lastly, relying on regulators to spot problems isn't helpful. If you're waiting for an audit to make any sort of improvements, you are way behind the game. Not receiving a 483 doesn't mean that you're, great, perfect, checked all the boxes. You really need to give yourself the opportunity to harness as much positive data as you can. Again, these things are very visible. Those Amazon stars, it's it's out there, and you want to take control of that narrative, not be reacting to that narrative based on things that are happening in the industry. All right, and then as far as what the regulators want, they really want to see you take it to that next level. They really do. They recognize that checking boxes is an approach, but that's not the intent, really. And if we are all as an industry focused on great patient outcomes, good quality products, then that is just beneficial to everybody. And so I think in the big picture, the agency recognizing that their focus on checking those boxes is they shift and give us permission to look at these things through that different lens, that everybody's gonna win in that scenario. Thank you guys so much for your time. I'm sorry that we ran over a little bit, but this is a really big, meaty topic. Let me run through the questions that we've got really quickly. If we want to comply or show compliancy with a particular guidance, for example, data governance, data privacy, data integrity, how do we know the particular requirements to adhere to or show we do it? David, John, you guys have some thoughts on that one? I think demonstrating compliance, there are still elements of it that are in your processes, right? And one of the things I always like to do, at least, you know, having done time in both pharma and device, I do love a good quality manual with a compliance matrix. And I like to line out the elements of that regulation or that standard, and then tie them to either the process, the procedure, or the output that demonstrates my compliance to that. Would that be how you'd go about it, David, you think?
I mean, I think that's a good start. You've got to understand what are the standards that, you know, you do need to meet. Now, again, you know, many of those criteria are interpretive, right? They're not black and white, but at least if you outline what are all the things that for your situation, you know, the regulators have talked about, then essentially you need to think about, okay, well, what would be my explanation about why we meet that? It's not whether you meet it, it's why we meet it in the way in which we interpret that. And I think that's a big part of when you build your rationale. It's bringing it to what makes sense for you, not just, oh, you know, yes, we have a system, it's validated. Okay, who cares if it's validated? Why? How did you do the validation in a way that makes sense in your situation, right? Or I'm just using that as an example. But I think in each case, you know, having some sort of matrix, like you said, to understand what are all those things that you need to, at a minimum, meet, that's important. And then you build your case around how you address that. And then if you have some documentation with a rationale about, even if you're doing it differently than exactly what's said there, if you built the case as to why you feel that's acceptable, that should be okay. And if an investigator comes and challenges that, you should feel good about the fact that, well, we have a rationale, here's why, and if you disagree with that, tell me why this isn't good enough. Don't just tell me it's not what says in the guidance, because frankly, I don't want to hear it that it doesn't, that the guidance says this. I don't give a darn. Tell me why what we're doing is not acceptable to meet the intent of the guidance, and then we can talk, right? So I think that's the way you build it.
Absolutely.
I think, you know,
absolutely.
It goes back to the old adage, you know, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And so having very easy and efficient ways to document discussions, meetings, and other things in which these discussions take place, having an ability to be able to categorize, analyze, and then categorize that risk effectively, again, from a business standpoint, not from a compliance standpoint. Ultimately, then you have the record, which is a price of admission from the compliance standpoint. You know, and I go back to use the, you know, the kind of a baseball analogy from now, you know, the umpire, you know, if you're throwing strikes and they're around the plate, you're more likely to get that curveball called for a strike, you know, and so you'll get the benefit of the doubt in that kind of a situation. So making it easy to have those records is the cornerstone of being able then to utilize those tools in an effective way for the business.
Absolutely. All right. And then we had somebody comment, and I thank you. That last bullet to remember can also be highlighted. When a 483 is issued and management is surprised, that one, you know, hadn't been issued earlier. Yeah, that's absolutely a a problem. You don't want to be surprised in these situations. And if anything, it almost becomes a bit of an opportunity, you know, to maybe have that conversation with your inspector, you know, as you alluded to, David, you know, if you can't come to some sort of understanding with them, keep having that conversation and don't be afraid to push on it. Because if you are focused on product quality, patient safety is the outcome, they're going to, and you're meeting, you know, the regulation as written, then there is no reason you can't continue to interpret these things.
You can't be afraid to challenge the inspector, right? If they're asking something that doesn't make sense,
We are losing.
that doesn't make sense, then you need to ask why. You know, just like they want you to explain why you're doing something.
Some technical difficulty. We can't hear David.
Yeah, David, you're breaking up pretty bad there.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
You may want to type your comments in the chat. We've lost him.
Yeah. No, David, we seem to have lost you. I'm glad we waited all the way till the end. Yay, Zoom. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, well,
I'm gonna
no
go.
worries, no worries.
I'm here.